Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you, of course, to the Pontifical Academy of Social Science and to my friends who invited me here today. I was here 1 year ago, and I'm very inspired to see the effort of the Holy Father and how much it has developed in the last year. And I think the messages that are sent to the public are extremely important, and we need to do a lot more. In the sermon this morning, I gave an example of a person that I met during my work. And I want to give you one more example because many of you were not there this morning. I met a young woman in one of the European countries who was asked by a friend of hers, that was very recently, who was asked by a friend of hers to go to another country that have better employment conditions to get a job. That was her best friend. So she left her country at 19 to go and work in another European country. The minute she got there, she was locked in a flat and she was forced to marry a third country national. And for 10 months, this third country national, now her husband, and a lot of other people also trafficked her for sexual exploitation. So we have a case of multiple forms of trafficking, if you like. After 10 months, a neighbor understood that she was locked in the room for all this time. She alerted the police. The authorities did a very good job. They helped her, and she went back to her country. She's still in the shelter because if she returns to her village, she's under threat. Her family is under threat. These organized networks threaten to kill them, both the family and her. The woman has blood cancer, and she has no access to health care in her country because it has to do with the regions and so on. So she's stuck in that situation. And I think this is, if we want to talk about trafficking, we need to remember that we are talking about real people in real situations suffering multiple forms of exploitation many times. And if we want to talk about trafficking here today, we need to remember what really this is. It is two things. We can talk about vulnerability all day. We can talk about poverty all day. We can talk about war. In reality, this is predominantly about money, about profits, and about demand. If people don't use the products and services of the victims, and if there is no profit, there is no trafficking. There's many other horrible things, but we don't call them trafficking. So we can easily say that trafficking in human beings is about buying and selling people and their services. So let's call it by its name. And it is a serious form of organized crime. And as such, it requires that we all cooperate together on various levels. So I'm very glad to be here because different stakeholders need to be involved in this very complex phenomenon. And I want to tell you a little bit about what we do at the EU. For us, it is a very high priority. The President of the European Commission, President Juncker, has stated very clearly this is a priority for the upcoming years. Unfortunately, it needs to remain a priority. And we also need to remember that in the Charter of Fundamental Rights, trafficking is the only form of crime that is explicitly prohibited. We are here to talk about an extreme fundamental rights violation. And we're here because, as we were told before, there are potentially hundreds of thousands of people at a given time in Europe today, as we speak, who are trafficked. And I want us also to remember that we have different forms of exploitation, of trafficking. Victims are forced to beg. They are trafficked into domestic servitude, some marriages, illegal adoptions, for the purpose of the removal of organs, to engage in criminal activities, benefit form, forced labor, sexual exploitation. And we're here to talk about going beyond criminalization. I don't know if we're even there in criminalization, and I'll explain. So we need to have criminalization. We need to have laws that prevent, protect, and criminalize. We need to ensure that we prevent the phenomenon, that we prosecute the criminals, and we protect the victims. And this is what the EU legislation does. I think I can very comfortably say that it is one of the most progressive legislations in the world because it has this comprehensive approach. What I do in this context is that I have been mandated to give strategic direction in the work against trafficking at the EU level, and I try to coordinate the services of the Commission as well as other entities, including EU agencies, in order to progress in the work that we do against trafficking. So, we heard a little bit about the scale of the phenomenon before. Let me tell you a little bit about what happens in Europe. What we know for the years 2010 to 2012 is only the number of registered victims. So we don't estimate, we don't speculate, we don't do this thing. We count how many people have been registered by the authorities. And we had 30,146 people who were registered. It is safe to say that the numbers are much, much higher. 80% of those victims were women, and 70% of the traffickers, the criminals, are men. 16% of those victims registered are children, girls, and boys. The most widespread form of exploitation is sexual exploitation, 69%, of which women and girls are the vast majority. 95% of them are women and girls. We also have trafficking for forced labor. It's 19% of the reported cases, and it affects mostly men and boys. I also want to say that 2/3 of the victims in the EU are EU citizens, the ones that are registered. Now, this could be because we're better at identifying the EU citizens. But nevertheless, there's a large number of people from the EU that are being trafficked. So tackling migration policies is a very important parameter of the work that we do, but it is not the only parameter when we talk about EU citizens being trafficked by EU citizens. And we want to talk about data because it's useful to guide our work and it's useful to guide our policy. But when we talk about the woman that I referred to in the beginning, we need to also think beyond numbers. It is not only about the scale of the phenomenon, but it is about real people in real life situations. So in the EU, as I said, we have the EU legislation that is a milestone, I think, in terms of how ambitious as a criminal law instrument it is. And our member states, our 28 member states in the EU, had to translate this into national law 2 years ago. The deadline was 2 years ago. 25 member states have already told us that they have translated this into national law, and we're still expecting Belgium and Germany to send us this information. I heard a little bit of the conversation yesterday in the room, and I want to also highlight that for the EU, it's very important that we're clear about concepts. So, for example, we talk about trafficking human beings and slavery interchangeably. And I think we have to make sure that we don't do that. Slavery, together with trafficking, is prohibited, of course, by the Charter of Fundamental Rights, but they're two different legal and social phenomena. So, why is it important to know that? Because not all trafficked people will necessarily be slaves. And not all slaves will necessarily be trafficked. And the more we are clear about that, the more we stand a chance to help properly all of them. I also want to clarify the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. We talk a lot about the people, the horrifying situation at the Mediterranean right now, and especially in Italy that we know of, all these people arriving on the boats. Human smuggling is a horrifying situation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is trafficking. And why do I say that? Because the first thing that we need to remember is the issue of consent. It's a difficult issue to talk about, but people who are smuggled pay an amount of money, they're extremely vulnerable, and they consent that they will take the trip to come, for example, to Europe in order to work. For the trafficked people, consent is irrelevant. I want to go back to what you said yesterday. Legally speaking, whether they consented or not, it is irrelevant. especially think about children. We shouldn't even be talking about consent. So when this woman went to this other country to work, she consented to go and work. What she didn't consent is to the continuous exploitation that resulted from that. Also, when it comes to trafficking, people don't need to cross borders. You can be trafficked as an Italian citizen within Italy, for example. When it comes to smuggling, people are, certainly there is a cross-border element. And the most important thing, when we talk about trafficking, we are talking about a person whose individual rights have been violated. When we talk about smuggling, this is a little bit different in the sense that it is a violation is a crime against the state, as opposed to a crime against an individual. So why am I saying all that? I'm saying all that because the more we understand this phenomena, the better able we will be to help the victims and protect them accordingly. Beyond criminalization, we need to understand the nature of the problem as a problem that affects women and men, boys and girls, but not always in the same way as the data demonstrates. For example, when it comes to the issue of sexual exploitation, trafficking for sexual exploitation, the European Union understands that as a structural form of violence against women. So when we talk about gender, we always think about trafficking of women and girls for sexual exploitation. This is not the whole story. This is part of the story. So when I talked before about statistics, this is what the member states told us. They included exploitation for prostitution or other forms in the areas of street prostitution, window prostitution, private flats, brothels, strip clubs, bars, pornography production companies, escort services, massage parlors, modeling agencies, hotels, private clubs, everywhere. Why am I saying that? Because what is important to remember is that there are very strong links between prostitution market and exploitation, trafficking, and organized crime. If we don't accept that, then we cannot help the people who are in this high-risk sector. And I want to be very clear. I am not here to say that all prostitution is trafficking. This is not what I'm here to do, nor my mandate to explore. But as one of the chiefs of the German Federal Police said, all sex trafficking they identified was in the prostitution sector. So we need to understand that this is a high-risk sector. We also need to understand that we need appropriate spaces for men and boys. Most of our countries, we tend to identify women and girls for sexual exploitation as the only form of trafficking. Well, this is not the case. We have an extreme number of people who are abused into forced labor. And we need to be able to protect these people who tend to be predominantly men and boys. We need to have specific shelters and facilities for these people. And we need to understand all these parameters. And that's why the European Commission has prioritized on labor exploitation, and we have a number of areas in which we work. We are now we have almost finalized a study of case law in all our member states to understand more and to help prosecutors. We have given extensive funding, and we're working a lot with labor inspectors. I will not bore you with that. Let me get to the most important parameter of the work we should be doing. I don't know if we do enough, which is children. There are no contested issues here. We're not here to talk about consent. We're not here to talk about work and workers' rights. We're not here to talk about forced labor of children. We're here to talk about child trafficking, and it is extremely clear what that means. This is something we have to prioritize. In the European Commission, we have issued a lot of guidelines. We have done a lot of work on that. We have given extensive funding. Some people say, you give too much funding for children. And I don't know what too much is when it comes to children and protecting children. And we also need to remember that a lot of the people who end up being forced into labor, forced into sexual exploitation, forced into sham marriages as adults, it starts off as children. So by protecting children, we're also protecting potential people who will become adults and continue being exploited. So, and for us, victims and children are at the very heart of our legal and policy framework. And as I said before this morning at the sermon, I mean, we seem to talk all the time about the traffickers, and I'm very glad to hear the ILO talk about, of course, we agree on criminalization. We are here to ensure that the law speaks of our values and our norms in society. Criminals have to be subject to justice. And we're here to talk about the victims. And we talk about the victims and how to help them. And we never talk about the real issue. Here are the criminals, here are the victims. Who is standing here? Who is using the services of those people? Who is buying the cheap products? Who is employing illegally those people? Who is forcing them into labor? Who is raping those women and girls and those boys and sometimes men on an everyday basis? Most of the times it's not the trafficker. Most of the times is the people around us, is the users. And because it is the people around us, the clients, the customers, the users, the procurers, we are very uncomfortable talking about it. So for every victim of trafficking, there's many, 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 many more perpetrators. And this is what we need to address. And I'm telling you this as a policymaker because it is my job to remind the member states that they have a legal obligation, according to the EU law, to discourage and take action to reduce demand. It is not because I think that personally. It is because it is a legal obligation. Our directive, also our legislation, also says that, that the member states have to at least, and I stress at least, consider making it a crime to use the services of victims of trafficking with the knowledge that the person is trafficked. And this is extremely serious because, again, this goes back to criminalization in another way. We are now drafting a report I have to draft a report to see how the member states translate the EU law into national law. And I'm very eager to see what the member states are doing to take action to reduce demand in a legal manner, and whether they're considering the criminalization part. And I have a question for you. That is a question that I have to reply in a report in 2016. Legal obligation again. Are you aware of any other area of crime where the person is knowingly, I stress the knowingly, involved and is not criminalized? I have spoken to prosecutors time and time and time and time again. They cannot think of an example. And my difficult job is to draft a report on what the member states have done on this issue. As Beate said before me, the law has a normative effect. Criminalizing those responsible is important. The document of the Vatican talks about criminalizing the traffickers, but I'm not referring to this. I'm referring to criminalizing those who knowingly make use of the services. And many people will say, but you know, it's very difficult to gather evidence. So what is the law doing? Do we say, with murder it's very difficult to find evidence, so we don't criminalize? Do we do that? Is that what the law is there for? Of course, we have to have good laws that help the evidence-building process, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't consider it. And we need a comprehensive approach on prevention in order to do that. And what we're doing at the moment is we launched a study to look at what all these prevention initiatives that we have done and we have funded throughout the EU, what have they achieved? Have we got less trafficking? When we have all these awareness-raising activities, do we stop potential traffickers? Do we stop potential users or buyers? Do we stop potential people who might become less vulnerable to being trafficked? We need to understand that more to do better policy in the future. If we also want to talk about going beyond criminalization, I said in the beginning that I understand trafficking as being about demand, and I think I covered that part, and about money. The ILO tells us that forced labor across the world is worth $150 billion annually. Around 50 of that, very broadly speaking, is around the European area, some of that. Who is making that money? I'm not just talking about money for the traffickers. I'm talking about money for illegal sectors, legal sectors engaged in illegal business, and legal sectors engaged in legal business. If we want to understand trafficking, if we want to help people, if we want to help victims, if we want to help that woman who was forced to marry the third country national and then repeatedly raped, we need to see who's making money out of it. These are the people we need to convict and criminalize. These are the people that need to be sanctioned. We need to follow that money, and we need to see who profits and why. I won't go into the internet, but a lot of those activities take place online. So we need to understand more about how to work with the private sector as well. I will come to that in a minute, but I can tell you that our legislation, again very progressive, stipulates that legal entities are accountable for human trafficking. So it's not just individuals, but it's also businesses that are now accountable. I am not aware to this date in Europe of a business having been convicted of the crime of human trafficking. This is where the money is. This is where we should be focusing. So if we want to move beyond criminalization, we also need to cooperate. We need to build partnerships between the private, the public, and the non-governmental bodies. In the European Union, we have launched a European civil society platform, 120 non-governmental organizations, some of them faith-based organizations, who work together collectively from different walks of life to address trafficking. We are also about to launch a European business coalition. As I said, if we don't work with the private sector, we don't really stand a chance. And we need to move beyond corporate social responsibility. Excuse my language, blah, blah. We need to see how to hold the private sector accountable. And I don't know, if I were a business person, which I'm not, I cannot think of a better advertisement than ensuring that your supply chains are slavery-free, that you don't employ, recruit, force slaves, knowingly or unknowingly. Sometimes it's unknowingly, but you have to make every effort to ensure that this is not the case. We also need to build partnerships between all sectors. The judiciary, law enforcement, border guards, social workers, consular services, immigration authorities, labor inspectors. I can tell you very confidently that the European Commission has joined forces with all these different sectors, and we're working very closely with them because it is the only way to get things done. And we also need to form partnerships between third countries and regional organizations. We have launched very close partnerships with non-EU countries, and this is at the heart of the work that we do. My job is to monitor the EU policy framework, the EU strategy against trafficking from 2012 to 2016. And a big part of this work has precisely to see who are the priority countries to work with. Because if a person comes to Europe and then ends up being forced into trafficked for forced labor, they come from somewhere. How do they come? What happens in that place of origin? How can we help in that place of origin? And how can we help that person if they are extremely lucky to be identified as victims, because very few of them are? If they are repatriated, how can we ensure that they don't end up being re-trafficked? Because many of them end up being re-trafficked. So we are engaged in this vicious circle. So, sorry, I'm changing my... So what I wanted to say today, I can give you a very long list of all the work we have done. I don't need to do that today. We have a website, it's all there. I can very proudly tell you that we have delivered on everything we have promised to up to now. What can the European Union do? We can legislate, and I think we have, not perfect, nothing is perfect in this life, but we can go as far as we're able to do, and I think we have very, very good legislation. We have very good policy that is accepted by the NGOs, by our member states, by our parliamentarians, and that makes me think that we're working in the right direction, and we have funding. So we can link the policy into the funding. Sometimes it makes people uncomfortable because, again, it's about money. But it is about making good use of your taxes and ensuring that those taxes go to the victims and not to advertising and paying salaries of people, but goes to the victims. So we do all that. But this is what the European Commission, what the European Union can do. If we don't implement all this, if it's just words on paper, legislation is fundamental, but at the end of the day, it's just words. If we don't implement this legislation, we don't stand a chance. And there, our member states have a long road to go. There's a lot more efforts done now than they were a few years ago, and that we need to recognize. We will be drafting, it is my legal responsibility to draft a report by the end of the year on the state of play in relation to trafficking in the EU, and we will take all these efforts into consideration. But more needs to be done. If we all do our job properly, I can assure you, we all know that we will have a lot less trafficking. Maybe we will not eradicate it, but it will certainly decrease to a very large extent. And if we really want to eradicate trafficking, we need to follow the money, and we need to discourage the demand that fosters all forms of trafficking of human beings. We need to discourage this demand. What is standing between the criminals and the victims is us, the citizens, who are responsible. There are much better people with me in the room speaking after on economics, but to me, if there is no demand, at least there is less supply. So we can talk all we like in the room, but I think if we fail to make use of all the possibilities that we have available, and we have a lot of possibilities, we have a lot of power in this room. We have legislation, we have policy, we have money, we have commitment, we have convictions, we have values. If we fail to use all of these possibilities to the maximum, we fail the victims. We fail that woman that I talked about in the beginning. And we need to take a personal responsibility. We need to go beyond criminalization, but we need to think about criminalization, because criminalization is not just on paper. We need to take our responsibility and have laws that have a normative effect, that explains what is acceptable and not acceptable, and then to convict people, not just have it on paper. So we need to move beyond criminalization, but first we have to do that too. And I think we have a role from each path of life, from the police, from policy, from charity, from faith. And our focus have to be those victims that we have all met, that we all know, and we have to remember that at the end of the day, we're working for them, for nobody else. We're working for them. Thank you.